Hello and welcome to another 5 prompts to try in Bing Chat. So this is actually the second video I'm doing this week on Bing Chat, and the reason why that is this one's got a little bit of a twist to it in that I'm going to be discussing sort of general prompt concepts in Bing Chat, but I'm going to be using like specific examples that follow those concepts. And so I've got 5 concepts that I have written out. The other reason why I've chosen to do it this week, having already done one, is it follows on nicely from some of the prompts I've done already and runs with some of the concepts that those prompts raise. So the first concept revolves around the idea of having a chat session with Bing where you get it to act as a friend having a chat. And within that concept, there's 2 branches, if you like, to that. One is where you use what I call an expert pre-prompt as part of, well, either before the prompt or as part of the prompt. And that's where it says something like, in the case of having a chat with a friend, it might be, imagine you are a friend who has read extensively or has a lot of experience in those sort of ones. That's with a expert pre-prompt. Without it, you just say, oh, imagine you're a friend and we're having a casual conversation on a stimulating topic. So let's try one example of that for the one where we're not using any sort of expert pre-prompting or conditioning or whatever you want to call it. I've noticed something strange. I don't think anybody else has noticed this. When I'm copying from Word into Bing now, I notice that it tends to squeeze words together randomly. I don't know why it's doing that. And it is rather annoying. So for this one, so I'm going to say, imagine you're a friend and we're going to have a casual conversation on a stimulating topic. Here is my opening question to you. I'm interested in your thoughts on the concept of the shadow self and how this has been applied to domains outside of psychology, such as AI. So let's just run this. Now, of course, when you're doing these, the idea is that you max these out. In what I mean by that is you just keep the conversation going based on what sort of replies you get. You can pick one of the answers that the chat comes up with, or you can type in your own. So it is as if you're having a sort of backwards and forwards. This is the sort of thing I used to often do on a Sunday afternoon with friends, and we'd hang out. We jokingly called it Sunday school, and we'd be discussing topics of the day and well into the night. So it's going into details about the shadow self, and I'm sure if you've been following any podcasts or news stories about chat, particularly in the era of GPT 3.53 onwards, and some interesting things that have been happening in relation to something people are referring to as the shadow self. And then you can follow up with this. You can follow up with your own thing, in much the same way as you might say to a friend, "Oh, that's interesting. Then what do you think about this?" So yeah, that's one possible way this can develop. Now, another example of this is one where you are using some sort of additional part to the prompt. So again, imagine you're a friend who has read extensively on the works of Jung and Alan Watts, because both of them had something to say about the shadow self. That's why I've specifically chosen them. But you could, you could use anybody here that has written on concepts of the shadow self. So That should be recent reports. I should have pasted this into Notepad actually. It'll probably be fine, it'll split it down anyway, but just in case it does something funky with the tokenization. Okay, so this time round I'm expecting the conversation to mould more around that expertise, whatever it might be. Now you could just also use general expertise, but these are more concepts that I'm talking about where you're priming the chat session in such a way that it goes in a particular direction. And you can see there's a bit of what, I use the term musing a lot here, but this is the chat musing, I suppose, is going away, looking up information that it needs, giving you a bit of description, a bit of information around that as it muses over it. And of course we're in the creative mode for this. And you can also try some of these. In the other modes. As always, I'll include these questions in the descriptions. Well, there you go. What do you think? In my perspective, do you have any questions or comments? I'd love to hear from you. So again, you can follow that conversation on. I have a question about your perspective. I could do something like, who else had something interesting to say about the question of shadow self, Castlevania, in this context. Again, sometimes you find yourself, you have to sort of keep it on subject occasionally, where it might drift if you don't. I mean, sometimes you do want it to drift, but sometimes you don't. So it's another thing to think about it. Think about. That's interesting. So it's not. Let's just see what's going on here. I've seen it occasionally do this before where it sort of stalls. Okay, yeah. Oh yeah, this was the one I was thinking of. Yeah, I'm curious, being really sort of, trying to be interactive. So again, it's interesting, taking a concept like this and running with it to see how it wants to be a bit more interactive. Yeah, so let's move on to the next one. So another concept I find interesting, and as I've said, some of this is lead on to previous ones, is this idea of having tables which show diametrically opposed things. So I'm just calling them diametrically opposed opposition tables. along with an explanation. I suppose that's tautology there. But some sort of opposition table. So create a table of 5 random philosophers, and for each suggest a philosopher whose views are diametrically opposed and explain why you picked the opposing philosopher. Now, of course, one thing you could do here is you could just list 5 philosophers and say, oh, please suggest 5 philosophers who are diametrically opposed to these philosophers. We've got Plato and Aristotle, Immanuel Kant and David Hume. Now, some of these may be contemporaneous with one another. They may have overlapped. And they may well be well known as to being adversaries or engaging in conversation with each other. And of course you might want to do it with authors as well, something like that. So yeah, this idea, this concept of opposition tables with an explanation, where you have two like diametrically opposed views and get it to explain why they're diametrically opposed. This can also manifest itself in other ways. You can do a thing in Bing Chat where you can create a sort of, argumentative conversation between 2 diametrically opposed individuals as well. The next concept is this idea of, I call it like a primer generator. So, for example, so here's an example of how this works with this idea of a generator style prompt applied to something, in this case primers. You could do a generator prompt to any sort of content that's not ridiculously large. Primer, I think, is a good way to experiment with this. So assume the role of a subject expert on a subject I will enter at the prompt. Who can say an expert on a subject I enter the prompt, who can produce easy to understand 500 word primers on that subject. The first subject is sunspots. So let's try that. So we should get a primer on sunspots. Now the idea with this is what I can then do is the next prompt that comes up, I can just type in the next subject and it follows the instructions that are already there. So it will just produce a primer on the next subject. It may even show me or suggest subjects to follow that up. Also, you could prime this, excuse the pun, but you could prime this with a prompt before you start this. It's just saying, what is a primer? But I find these really useful because it gives you a very broad overview of a subject area or thing. So you can drill down through that, but I can do let me think now. My mind's gone blank actually. I should have had a list of these. So another primer. Oh, let me just do corgis. Just see if it accepts that. So see if it's following my instructions about now sort of going forward, acting as a primer generator. And again, you can slightly change the wording within that initial generation prompt to you could like instead ask it, could you produce a bulleted list of interesting facts? And then you just keep typing subjects. Oh, look at that! Just keep typing subjects in there. So we do electric guitar. I'm just making sure that it is actually following my instructions. In terms of producing primers. Let's see what primer it produces on electric guitar. You could also type in something like, what term did I use here? Subject. So you could just say, oh, the next subject is. So the fourth concept, I suppose, is in some ways built on the first concept we looked at, which is we have a chat session that's behaving as a friend or conversational chat, however you want to think of it. And then this other idea of creating a prompt which acts as a generator of sorts, by you putting it into a certain state of mind, if you like. And this is the whole concept within Bing Chat of putting a chat session into a certain state of mind. That might be, I think when I think of that, there's two broad types of state of mind. One is, using words like please, or something I think I'm starting to call prompt etiquette, where you're putting the chat, if you like, into a sort of positive state of mind and seeing if it makes any difference, because it's good things to experiment. So making the chat happy. And you can do that through saying please and using other prompt etiquette. The other thing is, and this touches on what we've done earlier, is the idea of saying what it is or doing some sort of role playing. So let me give you the sort of two examples of that. Now in the second one, the wording's really important and we'll discuss that. But in the first one, I am really being over gracious here in an attempt to make it very agreeable. So let's have a look. Hi Bing, I'm very impressed in your very wide breadth of knowledge and the quality answers on many topics. There is a term I have heard being used recently, and I thought if anyone would know what the term means, you would, and would explain it in an easy to understand manner. The term is red teaming. Thanks in advance. So maybe we are being overly conversational there, but again, these are fun concepts to play around with, and seeing what that does, if anything, to the chat. Oh, we get a smiley face straight away. So the other example of that concept I was mentioning is this idea of getting the chat to role play or occupy a certain mind space or a certain sentiment or temperament is probably a better word. So let me just read this. So please assume the role of an opinionated philosopher. So, of course, there it can be interpreted one of two ways. It could be a philosopher that is known to be opinionated, of which I suspect there are many, but also a philosopher who isn't necessarily opinionated all the time, but on this matter is. So again, here's a place where you might want to just word it slightly differently, but we'll see where this goes. From the 18th century, you can choose a specific philosopher to role play. So I'm specifically saying, I want you to role play that. I will enter a subject at the prompt. So again, I'm also creating a generator style scenario, so I can keep just asking it different subjects, and I would like you to respond in an in-character manner. I'm sort of reiterating this. The first subject is on being late for dinner. And again, as this develops, you've got a couple of options here as well. You can choose to just keep giving it other subjects to respond in this case, an opinionated philosopher manner. It's also, I haven't asked it, but it is telling me what philosopher it's picking. So it's drawing on. Oh, changes the text. We've got a picture of Immanuel Kant. Oh, that's pretty succinct. Being late for dinner is a violation of the categorical imperative, which states that one should act only according to the maximum by which one can at the same time will that it should be a universal law. So if everyone was late for dinner, then dinner would lose its meaning and purpose, and the social order would be disruptive. Therefore, one should always be punctual for dinner as a matter of duty and respect for oneself and others. To be late for dinner is an act of irrationality and immorality. Immorally, and to disregard the dignity of human beings as ends in themselves. So we could then drill down on this. We could then ask it further questions, because it's now in the role of an opinionated philosopher. We'll see if it still assumes Immanuel Kant as the philosopher. So let's do on sleep. When I tried this out before, I did drill down through the first one and started asking as to whether I expanded on how far you would go on enforcing being late for dinner or not being late for dinner, and what if any, what laws did it violate, and was it an imprisonable offence? Okay, that's not really. What is it? I suppose I've picked a subject where it could be difficult to be opinionated on. What's what I say? However, sleep should not be indulged in excessively, as it would interfere with one's moral and intellectual duties. Oh no, okay. And to provide one of the opportunities and challenges of reality. Sleep should be relegated. So it is in character. On travel, I'm picking fairly. What's the word? I don't know if innocuous is the right word for this. Trivial. Picking fairly trivial things. However, travel should not be pursued for its own sake, as it would distract from one's moral and intellectual goals and make one dependent on external stimuli and sensations. Travel should be guided by a rational plan which aims at the improvement and expansion of one's mind and character. So can you assume, let me see if it'll easily jump tracks here. Assume the role of a different so I keep philosopher see what it does here. I suppose I could have said you choose. David Hume. Oh, on travel. Okay, so it's gone straight to on travel. That's interesting. What's the first one I asked? Let's see what David Hume has to say about on being late for dinner. I don't know whether he had tardy dinner habits or not. That's interesting. It's changed the text again. Being late for dinner. Oh, he says it's a variable and contingent fact. And it's a matter of custom and convention. Do you think there's any harm in being late for dinner? Yeah, so you can go down all sorts of ethical conversations about, what is the right punishment for being late for dinner. And then finally, so this falls into the concept, and this is quite a broad one, I suppose, getting it into areas of popular consensus with certain things. So, for instance, what is the popular consensus with regards to X? So here, and it's sometimes interesting to use terms that might mean something or could be abstracted by humans, but is a little bit unusual. Do we talk about pillars of learning for programming languages? Probably not, but most people will understand what that means. So let's see how it deals with this. So sometimes, again, this idea of pushing into areas where there may be a bit of ambiguity about the term in the context it's being used, and see what happens. Interesting. So it's going down the route of looking at it through different lenses, like the lens of fundamental concepts, the lens of paradigms, the lens of tools. So yeah, it was interesting to see when it can't pin something down, it can do this thing where it sort of switches roles, viewpoints, and suggests some different things. So what I'm going to do is just reword this. I will wipe this and do this. So what is the popular consensus with regards to so-called essentials for learning programming languages? So here you can see it's a bit more. Okay, that makes sense. And also the term essentials is different to pillars of learning. So yeah, much more. Now, just out of curiosity, if I do that one after this one without wiping it, so the one about the pillars of learning, interesting. Yeah. So yeah, interesting thing to play around with is this idea of having terms like pillars of learning, core concepts, key skills, essentials, which don't quite marry up necessarily with what you're asking, and just seeing where it pushes it, versus terms like, again, pillars of learning, core concepts, key skills, essentials, which do line up and sort of make sense together, and seeing how Bing Chat, like abstract, uses the term in an abstract manner or not. Okay, thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in the next episode.